Tonight, academic freedom, political correctness is the issue. We've got three prominent figures in that debate in recent years. I guess we'll go in this order. First, we have Jay Schalin. Jay began his life as a journalist. He joined the Pope Center in Raleigh, North Carolina, kind of a think tank watchdog organization focused on higher education. They issue a lot of important reports on what's going on in North Carolina and across the country. Peter Wood, some of you are familiar with Peter. He's been here before. Peter is the president of the National Association of Scholars. He was the provost at King's College, and he's an anthropologist and an accomplished author. Also, Casey Johnson, historian, distinguished historian at Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center here in New York. Focus in his historical work on mid-century American politics. He became very prominent in this debate when in the Duke Lacrosse case, the infamous lacrosse case from 10 years ago, Casey started an important blog called Durham in Wonderland, where he actually did genuine investigative work and focused on that case, and is one reason why that case was exposed for the abomination that it was. The book he wrote, co-wrote, was actually a finalist until proven innocent, was a finalist for the National Book Award, and he has been maintaining a beat on issues of due process on college campuses, and actually has another book coming out next spring on this. So we'll go about 10-12 minutes each to open it up for discussion. My only contribution is to note one quick thing, and that is that we had a big political correctness debate 25 years ago, 27 years ago, in which the issue of political correctness on college campuses really hit the national scene with a few important books, such as The Closing of the American Mind, Alan Bloom's, Dinesh D'Souza's Illiberal Education, Roger Kimball's Tenured Radicals, among others. And by and large in the public sphere, political correctness of the academic kind was proven, demonstrated, shown to be an illiberal, coercive, bullying condition, and it was generally deplored in the public sphere. Since then, on college campuses, what we call political correctness has only gotten worse. My colleagues, many of them, most of them, sort of center-left, moderate liberals, are themselves actually never have been so fearful, saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing. You never know when you're going to be recorded or filmed. And if you are caught doing the wrong thing or just alleged to have been done the wrong thing, you go into what lawyers will call the system. All right? Suddenly it's turned over to a whole other machinery of federal regulations, Title VII, Title IX issues, and the lawyers, it's in their hands now. Nobody wants to go there. And it only takes one case to make everyone else nervous. So this is where we are today. It's kind of a paradox. Everyone knows how bad this is, but it just keeps rising. With that, I'll turn it over to Jay. Start with Jay. Okay.
Thanks, Mark. I started working at the Pope Center in about 2007, and I had no real experience with higher education policy before then, and my conception of academic freedom was somewhat vague and often conflicting. I realized that there was a lot of justification for giving professors lots of freedom to explore and teach. At the same time, I realized that indoctrinating students was wrong. Unfortunately, a lot of people who should know a lot better also have similar vague and lack of clear understanding of the situation. When we went to have a debate at the University of North Carolina about this topic a few weeks ago, or actually it was a few months ago, the provost there was dumbfounded. He was like, how could you have a debate about academic freedom? Isn't everybody in favor of it? And this is somebody who has had some very major cases of academic freedom occur in recent years on his campus. And that is getting to be more and more the rule. Academia is starting to get rife with all of these academic controversies, probably to a greater degree since the since the 1960s. One of the reasons is seems to be this increasing radicalization of the faculty. They're kind of dumping the old professional model of academic freedom in which they treat it like a professional standards like you would have for the American Medical Association, the American Bar Association, and now they're insisting that it is some kind of absolute right that trumps any other argument against the activities of the faculty. And administrators generally are a cowardly bunch, academic administrators, that is, and they tend to choose political correctness over almost any other stance, and that's one of the reasons why we're seeing a lot of things like these very intrusive speech codes that prevent people from saying almost anything. Another reason is more and more students and sort of dissident faculty are starting to stand up against the system. There is a growing number of organizations, mine being one, and other organizations like FIRE and the ADF, it used to be the Alliance for the Defense of Freedom, and others are standing up to help them out. There's also an increasing presence of students who demand a right not to be offended by anything they see or hear. And that's an absurd claim that is naturally going to come into conflict with the legitimate rights of everybody. Administrators tend to be too timid to have them laughed off campus, as they should be. My particular favorite example, a few years ago, I was at UNC Chapel Hill again. A congressman, a former congressman, Virgil Goode, who was an anti-immigration or anti-illegal immigration advocate, a bunch of students tried to shout them down, and as they were being hauled out of the lecture hall, one of them was shouting about having his right to free speech denied. Now, depending on political realities, states represented by legislators or trustees or boards of governors may start pushing back now so that the public universities serve the interests of the public rather than being these unaccountable sanctuaries for intellectuals and activists. And while working on maybe after working on my report, Academic Freedom in the Age of Political Correctness, I kind of came up with 4 basic principles. The one is that academic freedom is best perceived as some sort of a natural right. Russell Kirk kind of said that it has been proven over time to accord with human nature. And that's kind of a better conception than as a professional standard. However, the American Association of University Professors tends to take it a little too far, and they take the natural right to mean it trumps every other right of anybody else. Let's see. Now, the reason I'm so against professionalism or a set of professional standards is because there's an inherent conflict of interests that go on with that. On one hand, the AAUP represents the interests of the faculty. On the other hand, they're supposed to have this sort of neutral, unbiased conception of academic freedom that serves the purpose of truth rather than just the faculty. And time after time, they simply go with, let's serve the interests of the faculty. And also, when you have a consensus of professionals, it can sort of coalesce into this tyranny of the majority, where one thing I've seen is a lot of older professors like tenure because it has enabled them to say what they've needed to say. The problem is that the same consensus that gave them tenure at one time is denying tenure to younger professors. The second principle is that the justification for granting a scholar academic freedom is the free investigation into the truth requires them to be able to investigate freely. And let's see. And this is something that a free, open society needs to thrive. Otherwise, knowledge and education calcify into indoctrination and orthodoxy. But there have to be different standards for research and teaching. On one hand, you have a professor comes up with a hypothesis that he doesn't know whether it's right or wrong. He should be able to pursue that in a research vein, but he should not be able to teach that as fact in a classroom. And the third one is that there's sort of a great conundrum of academic freedom. And that is that if the absence of academic freedom tends to stifle knowledge and learning, so does total freedom, because you end up with a problem of activism. And activists deny the spirit of open inquiry. Their goal is political. They start with a political goal and accept or deny evidence according to whether it serves their needs to forward that goal. And as a result, I tend to don't see them as activists as deserving of academic freedom. Let's see, and just a good quote from along those lines from Russell Kirk again. It is a principle of English and American jurisprudence and statecraft that we are not compelled to extend freedom to those who would subvert freedom. And I kind of see that you can extrapolate that, a need to constrain academic freedom at some times. Fourth, although academic freedom should be considered a natural right, it's not an absolute empirical or ethical imperative that can shut down all debate. Academic freedom comes with obligations as well as rights, and there should be an underlying framework that weighs all the rights of all the various interests. Otherwise, you really don't serve this pursuit of the truth properly. Now, many in academia seem to think that we're still fighting the same old battle that Galileo was fighting back in the Enlightenment, or that people were fighting back in the 1800s to get so that they could use the scientific method as their rule of truth. That's not really the case today. Things are much more complex. As an example of this complexity, I'll throw this out there. University of Wisconsin professor Donald Downs wrote something for us, and in it he said, "There is a right to profess that the world is flat, but such expressions would be grounds for flunking a course in geography or astronomy, and for terminating an instructor who taught such nonsense." And certainly that's true, but then things can get very complex when a professor says the world is flat, but they're teaching algebra, and this never enters into the picture, and they have enough self-control not to talk about it in class. In many cases, that person is allowed to continue teaching. And you can just keep parsing various particulars ad infinitum that change what you should do in each case. And so I feel that the best way to handle that is in the court system. Academia is much better suited towards theorizing. In court cases, both sides are argued, and then you have a supposedly impartial third party come up with a decision. And I think that's the best way to work through all the various particulars. I would also like to see universities and university systems routinely review their policies according to recent court cases and other things that have come to light. I'd like to see governing boards step up and do their part. The system just doesn't work without active boards. The problem is the selection process is often rigged so that strong-minded people do not become trustees or governors or various other members of boards. And just the great genius of our founding fathers was to create a constitution that balanced competing interests rather than only serving the most powerful. And I suggest that that's the best way to look at academic freedom, as a way to balance all the variety of interests. And thank you.
Thanks, Jay. I've worked with the Pope Center for many years, and I'm a great admirer of it. And if it's an organization you don't know, you should take some trouble to learn about them. I see here tonight a room full of members of the National Association of Scholars and friends of the National Association of Scholars and people who will be members of the National Association of Scholars. Well, the stories are legion, and I think you would not be here if you did not know them, at least some of them. Let me start with one a little bit abstracted. A man forced to make a public avowal of commitment wrote secretly about his disaffection. He'd seen cases of such severe reprisals that the fear of his own safety had led him to a stance of silence. And though he was extremely cautious and kept his head down, much as the authors of a recent book, Passing on the Right, John Shields and Joshua Dunn, have urged, his efforts to deceive his colleagues failed. They began to suspect him of harboring disloyal thoughts. They whispered, they plied him with gotcha questions, and finally they accused him outright, which led to rather bad things. Now, this is not a case at Duke or at Oberlin or UVA or Brown. It's not even about higher education. It's part of that great Gothic classic, Melmoth the Wanderer, the novel that set the tale of psychological terror into motion in English literature. Melmoth the Wanderer is a book crammed with suffocating stories of imprisonment in lunatic asylums, monasteries, secret chambers, crypts, and dungeons. The characters thirst for freedom, but are checked at every turn by lies, deceptions, and enforced conformity. Now, the author of Melmoth was an impoverished Irish clergyman named Charles Maturin, and he got a lot of things right. His dark imagination took him to settings around the world, from the Irish coast to the Indian Ocean, where he pictured the intermingling of selfishness, fanatical belief, ambition, the lust for power and domination, hypocrisy, and people trapped in resentment of their own emptiness. Now, the last of these probably deserves an English noun, but if one exists, I haven't found it, so I'm going to give it the adjective Melmothian. While Maturin conjured many variations of this theme, it was beyond his powers to picture the modern American university, an institution dedicated in principle to freedom, freedom of inquiry, freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, and an institution tireless in promoting itself as the embodiment of those virtues. But in reality, an institution as close-walled and as oppressive as anything Charles Maturin depicted. So we're here to discuss academic freedom in the age of political correctness, the title of Jay's essay, a subject I've written about extensively and lectured on frequently, and I know how easy it is to get detoured into details, to examinations of particular cases, and thus not actually reach the larger arguments. So this time I'm going to skip the details of the latest campus outrages against academic freedom and concentrate on a response to Jay's very constructive essay. There are points where he and I have solid agreement and some points of divergence. Naturally, the latter are of most interest. But let me start with the areas of agreement. Jay defines academic freedom most broadly in his white paper as the right to seek the truth. He allows that this can mean different things to different people. The conflicts have turned academic freedom into a lovely phrase, a particularly disordered concept. Academic freedom is on the whole dominated by, he puts it, a vested interest group, namely the faculty. The increased politicization of the faculty is undermining the faculty's claim to high moral ground. He says we need proper limits, checks, and balances on scholarly inquiry, teaching, and academic commentary. And he sharply distinguishes First Amendment freedoms from academic freedom. The First Amendment protects individuals from government action that abridges their free speech. Academic freedom deals with the contextual rights of individuals within colleges and universities for freedom of expression. Now, I agree with all of this and a great deal more in Jay's thorough, historical, and closely argued essay, and I commend it to you if you haven't already read it. So, where is there room for disagreement between Jay's views and mine? The most important divergence, I think, is on the deeper causes of what has turned academic freedom into a disordered concept. Jay's thesis is that at the root of this disorder is faculty domination, the faculty acting in its perceived self-interest to insulate itself from criticism, to invalidate administrative oversight, to minimize or obliterate the rightful claims of others over research, teaching, and intramural and extramural expression. Those are odd ways of saying, talking about what you want to. From this thesis flows some consequences, consequential consequences. One of them is that Jay invests considerable confidence in the value of the legal process to create, quote, a standard of academic freedom that is fair for all. I'm skeptical. By legal processes, he means the courts, and what is attractive about the courts to him is that they allow competing interest groups to advocate for themselves before a supposedly impartial tribunal. He just said that. The broader consequence is that Jay holds that these and other interest groups, students, other interest groups, non-conforming faculty, administrators, trustees, society at large, that these things are indeed groups and that they have definable interests in some manner approximating what the faculty have as an interest group. Fear of lawsuits is the great stick he mentions to motivate faculty to get things right, while the new media, blogging, can serve to expose and confront and presumably build the momentum that will give that stick force. And Casey Johnson is the outstanding, maybe the example par excellence of someone who has used the new media precisely to that effect. These arguments are surely reasonable. As someone who's been doing battle with the AAUP for many years, that's the American Association of University Professors, I'm only too aware of how the progressive left, acting through the AAUP, has twisted the doctrine of academic freedom to serve careerists as well as ideological advocates within the faculty. Jay mentions one of the AAUP's most egregious expansions of academic freedom, its 2007 document, Freedom in the Classroom, which licensed faculty members to say and do just about anything imaginable in the classroom, appropriating academic freedom as a reason to engage in outright political advocacy and basic outrageousness. Within a month or so of the publication of that document, I fisked it. I wrote about a 30-page compendium of its numerous assaults on principles and reason. So I'm in this battle with Jay. I see the problem. My argument isn't that Jay's thesis is totally off target, but that interest group analysis, if I can call it that, hits only the edge of the target. Why is it that in over 1,000 years of development, it is only now that academic freedom has become a disordered concept, that, as Jay calls it? His answer is to trace the history of the concept patiently, step by step, through the centuries, the declarations, the court decisions, and the ever-changing cultural context. So it's a kind of particularistic answer. My answer is that those cultural contexts count far more than the faculty as an interest group. Interest groupishness gives the leftist professoriate tools to enact their will, but whence cometh that will? Why are professors so ready or even so eager to burn down their own house? Now, my answer is that we're living through a cultural shift far more powerful than anything our judicial process can be expected to tame. Indeed, the judicial process itself is often an accelerant. The great shift has epistemological, cognitive, emotional, and other psychological dimensions, and I hardly have enough time to say that sentence, let alone break it down and describe the parts, but I'll settle for evoking this. We are in a secular age where authenticity, in a special sense, counts for more than truth, and the badge of authenticity is unbridled rage. If you can't properly get yourself unbridled, at least you can perform your anger. Power flows to the angry. Think of Black Lives Matter. Anger feels like power. Rationality serves at best as a servant to the emotions, and it goes where its angry master tells it to. Jay distinguishes what he calls the transcendent view of academic freedom, and he comes out on its side, from the pragmatic view. We'll leave the pragmatic view aside. I'm not sure we have any spokesman for it here. The transcendent view is that truth exists and is to some degree attainable. Russell Kirk calls the pursuit of truth, as we just heard, a natural right. The clergyman, the author of Charles Maturin, would surely have agreed with Russell Kirk about that, but he probably would have observed that human nature also has built-in obstacles to that pursuit. We are walled in by selfishness, fanatical belief, ambition, lust for power and domination, hypocrisy, and that Malthusian quality of resenting our own emptiness. The term that wraps all these psychological urgencies that steer the pursuit of truth into shipwreck is political correctness. It is a phrase born of irony among Marxists of a century ago that now encapsulates the collective will to impose intellectual conformity over the whole of culture, but failing that, at least over the local community. Political correctness seethes with ambitions and resentments of its leaders and the insecurity of its enthusiastic followers. Better to do to others before they do unto you. The ideologies it promotes are often sub-intellectual and explicitly anti-intellectual. One might think that this would make those ideologies a hard sell in the company of the learned, but it has turned out otherwise. There is a positive attraction to radical simplifications, including those that stand in imposing contradiction to the facts of experience. Forcing others to uphold views that you know yourself are false is among the delights of the Malthusian professor. To intoxicate others with the liquor one only pretends to drink is one good way to turn academic freedom into an ideological weapon. So is sinking others' lives into lives of torpor or fantasies of escape. Think of the sustainability movement. I don't say that all or even a majority of the doyens of political correctness are of this cold, manipulative, suavely ironical type, but more than a few of them are. In a recent lecture, I coined the mnemonic outrage for the 7 elements of politically correct suppression of intellectual freedom. That is, O for ostracize, U for usurp, T for train, R for repress, A for acidify, G for group, and E for exalt. Outrage. Ostracize those who dissent from political orthodoxy. Think of George Will being sent you're no longer welcome here note from the president of Scripps College, or numerous other disinvitations of our time. Usurp. Usurp what? Usurp the curriculum. Get rid of courses that no longer serve the purpose of the day. So the feminists at Springfield College in Massachusetts have decided that 6 or 7 courses on women in literature are perfectly good, but one on men in literature has to go. And the man who wants to teach it is now teaching 4 sessions of expository writing to freshmen at 8 a.m. in the morning. Usurpation of the curriculum is not normally what we think of first when we talk about political correctness, but it is the 7/10 of the iceberg below the water. That's where this stuff is really happening. What's not being taught and what is being taught. T for train. That's train students to be activists, get them to become community organizers. A major transformation of higher education is underway. We're about to release a report on this called Making Citizens. We make citizens now by the moment the freshmen arrive, or first years as they're now called, arrive on campus. They are sent out to be volunteers. The students have a term for that. It's called volunteering. Volunteering is replacing the curriculum, and the people who support it make no bones about it. It's much more important to go to college to learn to be an activist, and that curricular stuff on the side, never mind, than it is to go there to become a learned person. Okay, what are we up to? R. R for repress. Thank you. Some people can spell. Repress refers to those topics that are ruled unfit for discussion. People know they're important, but they're unwilling to talk about them. When you are holding back your knowledge that the earth isn't heating up quite so much, the apocalypse that was promised for year 2000 and has been delayed a year ever since hasn't happened, you're engaged in a psychological process of repressing truth. We do that in many areas. Again, I'm going to avoid going through the details. We're up to A. I didn't do very well with A. I came up with acidify, by which I mean that transformation of the campus into a place where people are really sour. That sense of, as my colleague Rochelle Peterson has called it, nudging. Every moment of the day you're being nudged to follow a particular path, even if it's removing the trays from the cafeteria so you have to juggle 5 or 6 plates so you can think about sustainability while you try to eat your banana. That's what the acidify is. It's making the campus a safe place for the ideologues and an unsafe place for everybody else. We are up to G. G is an easy one. G stands for group, and it stands for that, we call it turning people into categories defined by race, sex, ethnicity especially. The racialization of campus into groups that are not only defined, that are defined in terms of their resentments. That dynamic has become a key part of the reign of political correctness. When you go to college, you're no longer an individual. You may have thought you were. You may have thought you were there to cultivate your individuality in some sense. But no, that's off the table now. You are who we tell you you are. And if you happen to be a white male, well, your job is to atone for the next 4 or 5 years. Okay. And finally, E. E is for exalt, exalting certain ideas and beliefs so that they are exempt from questioning or critical examination. And expressions of dissent can be suppressed, therefore, as acts of malignity. Let me wrap this up. What is the proper response to tactics of outrage? Well, I won't rule out court cases. They may be helpful. I'm involved in one right now. Nor would I rule out organizations such as the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, the Pope Center, the National Association of Scholars. We do have some successes, and we are trying to turn the inchoate dislike of political correctness in society into some kind of force to be reckoned with. So, okay, we'll do that. But the only real force that avails against a cultural shift of this magnitude is another cultural shift. Now, there are ways to prepare for that, but there's no way to make it occur on schedule. Melmoth the Wanderer spent 150 years looking for someone to relieve him from his diabolical bargain. If it takes that long, we will not have a civilization worth preserving. In that sense, academic freedom encodes some of our deepest values. I'm compressing here. It may have become the plaything of an interest group. But it is one of those concepts that reaches far beyond what an interest group can make of it, far beyond its local circumstances, to encapsulate much of what a civilization stands for. We anthropologists call it a focal cultural concept. It is, as Jay says now, a disordered concept. But we can do a lot better to restore it than litigating it to death. Thank you.
So my thanks to the Pope Center for the invitation, to Mark for the kind words. When we think of threats to academic freedom in the popular mind, the impression dates back to World War I and the attacks on anti-war professors, or to the McCarthy era and the attacks on left-wing professors. But for many years, the primary threat to academic freedom has come from within the academy rather than from the outside. This, of course, is not to say that there aren't threats from politicians or from donors, because, of course, there are, but it's not the sustained threat. Mark's piece from a little more than a decade ago on groupthink really illustrated that, I think, particularly well, the degree to which certain ideas become extreme and in which dissenters are discouraged from speaking out in opposition. But in the last few years, I think there's been another pattern that's emerged, an interesting relationship between forces outside of the academy strengthening opponents of academic freedom, defenders of the status quo, from within the academy. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that in two concepts on which I've written a bit. The first is the protests of the last couple of years and the way in which these protests have been refracted through the media. And then the second is the redefinition of Title IX and how that's affected academic freedom, and how opponents of academic freedom inside the academy have used this to their advantage. So neither of these episodes, the campus protests or the redefinition of Title IX, had as their primary motivation a suppression of academic freedom or dissenting thoughts on campus, but both had a natural consequence going in this direction. So first of all, the protests, we all know about the basic protests, which started at the University of Missouri and spread to several dozen schools, frequently tailored towards particular kinds of institutions. Elite liberal arts schools, Ivy League institutions, institutions where certain kinds of faculty mindsets exercised particular emphasis on campus. The primary thrust of most of these protests was not necessarily speech or speech-related issues. Indeed, the common thread in most of these protests often tended to be job-related aspects, a desire for certain quotas in faculty hiring or in administrative positions. But there also was a spillover in terms of speech. We all know the highest profile example of this at Yale, where a central motivation of the protesters was the dismissal of the Christakises for their, in a perfect example of outrage, for their expressing thoughts that were perceived as coming from beyond the pale. I wanted to talk just a bit about a couple of other examples along these lines that get a little less attention, but I think also illustrate the pattern. The first were the protests at Amherst, which occurred last fall in the aftermath of both the Missouri and the Yale protests. This theme of intellectualism and anti-intellectualism was present in these protests. Amherst was one of a number of protests where part of the target was an attempt to occupy the library and to prevent students who did not affiliate with the protests from studying in the library. And the occupation of the library earned the public praise of Amherst president, Biddy Martin, who attacked those who suggested that an anti-intellectual trend motivated the protesters. The protesters also earned the support of 17 academic departments, including signatures from each member of these departments, a way of calling out those who dissented from the norm. And among the protesters' demands, there were 10 central demands, was the punishment of two groups of anonymous students whose identities fortunately were never discovered. A group of students who had posted pro-life protesters on campus with the theme of All Lives Matter, and a group of pro-First Amendment students who had posted posters praising the University of Missouri student journalist who was attacked by Melissa Click in the famous event on campus at Missouri. The protesters demanded that Amherst discipline these students, essentially a re-education proposal, which garnered no opposition at all. So this idea of using college power against freedom of thought. And similarly, a couple of months later at Duke, one of the patterns to me of these protests was although there were differences in tactics between the protesters, faculty, and administrators, they shared a similar vision of the academy. And in response at Duke, the Duke administration chose to convene an open forum to discuss matters with the protesters, presided over by President Richard Broadhead in the midst of his second 5-year term in the aftermath of the Lacrosse case, no consequence for any academic malfeasance at Duke, and by the new dean of Duke's faculty, a woman named Valerie Ashby. The protesters complained that there was insufficient support for diversity among the faculty, and at that point, Ashby revealed a previously non-public change to Duke's tenure and promotion policies. She said that since coming on as dean, she had indicated, and that all untenured faculty had received a message, that intolerance would no longer be tolerated at Duke. And that the message that she had given to junior faculty was that those who are intolerant, you must go. In response to this address, both Eugene Volokh and I emailed Duke spokespersons asking for the criteria, what constitutes intolerance. Duke has refused to supply the criteria, but of course that's the purpose. The idea is to create a vague criteria that can be used against any dissenting faculty on grounds that they're intolerant and that they must go. So the second pattern, which in some ways is related to this thematically, is Title IX. So Title IX, the redefinition of Title IX began from the Obama administration in 2011 with the issuance of this Dear Colleague letter from the Office for Civil Rights. And the primary thrust here, again, was not necessarily academic freedom. The goal of OCR was to eviscerate the due process rights of students accused of sexual assault on campus and to create a system where once accused, it's almost impossible for a student to prove their innocence. OCR has taken the Broadhead standing one step further. You no longer need a trial to prove your innocence. In this case, you don't even get the trial. You simply are drummed out. However, the move to redefine adjudication towards sexual assault has spilled over into speech-related issues that tie into gender questions on campus. And again, I wanted to give a couple of examples. The highest profile was this thing called a blueprint, a formal binding document that was entered into by the Justice Department and by the Education Department with the University of Montana in 2013. And the blueprint required Montana to keep track of all speech, student speech as well as faculty speech, that anyone on campus reported as in any way offensive related to gender. The normal rule of a reasonable person standard did not apply in the Montana case. If it had ever gotten to court, it would have been interesting to see how this played out. FIRE was the key organization in protesting this. OCR announced that when they said that this was going to be the blueprint for all other colleges and universities, they didn't mean the blueprint, they meant a blueprint, and therefore it wasn't necessarily going to be broader than Montana. But that promise has proved to be ill-founded. An almost identical blueprint was imposed on the University of New Mexico next year, and it's clear that this is a broader pattern. A more serious issue comes in the nature of chilling student and faculty speech with regards to Title IX. And so there's one institution that OCR, as part of a resolution agreement signed in 2012, requires to document and publicize all Title IX related investigations, and that's Yale. So every 6 months, the deputy provost of Yale, a woman named Stephanie Spangler, produces a 15 or 20-page report that summarizes all Title IX cases that had occurred at Yale in the previous 6 months. These reports are extraordinarily broadly worded and with minimal factual detail. The purpose here is to make sure that anyone who reads the report can't get a sense of how strong or weak many of these claims actually are. Most of the Title IX claims deal with allegations of sexual misconduct or sexual assault of one type or another, but an increasing number deal with issues of speech, and the way in which they've been adjudicated are quite chilling. For instance, 2 years ago, there was an allegation against a male faculty member in an unnamed department by a female colleague who alleged that the professor had said inappropriate items in class. So this was a classroom-related approach. The Title IX office investigated. They did not inform the professor that he was being investigated. They instead spoke only to the complaining professor and to the professor's department chair. And the resolution was that the professor, who again was never informed that he was investigated and so had no opportunity to even present evidence of his innocence, was subsequently monitored by his department chair and apparently is still being monitored by his department chair. Presumably he will be monitored indefinitely by his department chair for what was a Star Chamber investigation in which he never got a chance to defend himself. A second case dealt with a graduate student newsletter that published something, and again, the purpose of these Spangler reports is to provide minimal detail, but something that offended 2 female students on campus. So they complained. Rather than write a letter to the editor, they complained to the Title IX office. The Title IX office commenced an investigation. At least in this case, the students were informed that they were being investigated. Now, the logical response in any institution that believes in freedom of inquiry or expression would be to say, in what amounts to a journalistic publication, unless you're saying something false or libelous, you have the right to say what you want. Yale didn't do that. Instead, the grad counseled, in the euphemistic language of the Spangler reports, to avoid such comments in the future, and they apologized as a result. Now, the only reason we know anything about this is because of these required Spangler reports, but there is no reason to believe that on every campus that has an active Title IX bureaucrat and a position that's dramatically expanded in power in the last several years, we don't have comparable organizations. So how is all of this going to end? A couple of points here. The first is a reminder that while the faculty are the primary thrust in terms of this internal threat to academic freedom, they're joined by administrators, increasingly powerful administrators in the student life, diversity, and Title IX bureaucracies. And more troublingly, they're increasingly joined by student bodies. I was telling Mark beforehand, the opening session of the Brown student government this year was declared a safe space. And as a result, the media were expelled from the deliberations. So the idea that uncomfortable ideas can not only not be discussed, but whenever ideas are discussed that you don't want people to hear about, outsiders can be excluded on grounds of safe space, suggests that the problem is more than just the faculty. It requires, to some extent, outside intervention. It certainly requires more aggressive oversight from trustees and alumni, who are, if we're going to stay within the system, are the groups that need to be far more active. Thanks.